Jamal sat on a worn bench in Central Park, his weathered hands clasped tightly around a paper cup filled with lukewarm coffee. The bustling city of New York continued its relentless pace around him, with joggers, tourists, and business people hurrying past, barely sparing him a glance. As he observed the constant flow of people, Jamal couldn't help but feel the weight of his isolation pressing down on him. His mind drifted to memories of a different life, one where he had a job, a home, and a sense of purpose. It wasn't that long ago when he worked as a skilled carpenter, taking pride in crafting beautiful furniture and restoring old homes. But a series of unfortunate events, a workplace injury, mounting medical bills, and a sudden economic downturn had stripped away everything he had worked so hard to build. Now, each day was a struggle for survival. Jamal had learned to navigate the city's complex web of shelters, soup kitchens, and public spaces where he could rest without being hassled by the authorities. He had become adept at blending in, making himself invisible to those who might view him as a nuisance or a threat. As the sun began to set, Jamal gathered his few possessions and made his way to a familiar alley where he often spent the night. The narrow passageway between two towering buildings offered some protection from the elements and prying eyes. He had just settled into his usual spot when he heard a commotion echoing from further down the alley. Laughter mixed with taunts and a frightened voice reached his ears. Jamal hesitated, knowing that getting involved could be risky. He had learned the hard way that minding his own business was often the safest course of action on the streets. But something about the fear in that voice compelled him to investigate. Cautiously, Jamal crept towards the source of the noise. In the dim light, he saw a group of teenagers surrounding a younger boy. The boy, dressed in expensive clothes that looked out of place in this gritty alley, was pressed against the wall, his face a mask of terror. The teenagers, emboldened by their numbers, jeered and shoved the boy, demanding his wallet and phone. Jamal recognized the look in the boy's eyes. It was the same fear he had felt when he first found himself on the streets, vulnerable and alone. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Jamal stepped out of the shadows and called out to the group. "Hey, what's going on here?" His voice, rough from disuse, carried an authority that surprised even him. The teenagers turned, momentarily startled by the interruption. Jamal stood his ground, drawing himself up to his full height. He may have been homeless, but years of physical labor had left him with a still imposing frame. "This ain't your business, old man," one of the teens sneered, trying to mask his uncertainty with bravado. Jamal took another step forward, his mind racing to find a way to diffuse the situation without violence. "Maybe not," he replied evenly, "but I'm making it my business. Why don't you boys run along before this gets complicated?" He locked eyes with the leader of the group, silently communicating that he wasn't going to back down. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then, muttering curses under their breath, the teenagers began to retreat. They knew that the element of surprise was gone, and the potential reward wasn't worth the risk of tangling with an adult who might draw unwanted attention. As the group disappeared around the corner, Jamal turned his attention to the boy, who was still pressed against the wall, breathing heavily. "You okay, kid?" he asked, keeping his distance to avoid frightening the boy further. The boy nodded shakily, his eyes wide as he looked at Jamal. Yes," he stammered. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up." Jamal shrugged, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "Don't mention it. You shouldn't be in this part of town alone, especially at night. Where do you live?" "Upper East Side," the boy replied, his voice steadying. "I'm Tyler Prescott." Jamal raised an eyebrow at the mention of one of the city's wealthiest neighborhoods. "That's a long way from here, Tyler. How'd you end up in this alley?" Tyler looked down, embarrassed. "I was trying to prove something stupid to some kids at school. They dared me to come down here and take a selfie. I didn't think... I never expected... Well, lesson learned, I hope." Jamal said gruffly, but not unkindly. "Come on, let's get you to a main street where you can catch a cab home." As they walked together towards the busier part of the neighborhood, Jamal couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between them. A homeless man and a rich kid from different worlds, brought together by chance. Tyler kept glancing at him, curiosity and gratitude evident in his eyes. Neither of them knew it yet, but this chance encounter would be the beginning of a friendship that would challenge their perspectives and change both their lives in ways they could never have imagined. The next morning, Jamal awoke to the sound of a car engine purring nearby. He blinked, disoriented, as his eyes adjusted to the bright sunlight filtering into the alley. To his astonishment, a gleaming red Ferrari was parked at the entrance of the alley, looking completely out of place among the dumpsters and graffiti-covered walls. Cautiously, Jamal approached the vehicle. A crisp white envelope was tucked under one of the windshield wipers. He hesitated before reaching for it, half expecting someone to jump out and accuse him of trying to steal the car. When nothing happened, he carefully removed the envelope and opened it. Inside was a handwritten note on expensive stationery. It read, "Dear Sir, my son Tyler told me about your brave intervention last night. Words cannot express my gratitude for your actions. As a token of our appreciation, I'd like to invite you for coffee this morning. If you're agreeable, please meet me at the Bluestone Cafe on 5th Avenue at 10 a.m. The Ferrari is at your disposal should you wish to use it. Sincerely, Robert Prescott." Jamal reread the note several times, his mind struggling to process the situation. The offer seemed surreal, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it might be some kind of elaborate prank. He glanced at the Ferrari again, its keys dangling invitingly from the ignition. For a moment, Jamal considered walking away. His life on the streets had taught him to be wary of anything that seemed too good to be true. But curiosity and a faint glimmer of hope compelled him to at least see what this was about. He decided against driving the Ferrari, knowing it would attract unwanted attention. Instead, he made his way to the cafe on foot, arriving just before 10 a.m. The Bluestone Cafe was an upscale establishment, and Jamal felt acutely aware of his shabby appearance as he entered. A well-dressed man in his 50s stood up from a corner table and approached him. "You must be the gentleman who helped my son," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Robert Prescott. Thank you for coming." Jamal shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the expensive watch on Robert's wrist. "Jamal Thompson," he introduced himself. "I appreciate the invitation, but I'm not sure why I'm here." Robert gestured to the table. "Please sit. Let's talk over coffee." As they settled into their seats, a waiter appeared with a tray of coffee and pastries. Robert waved away Jamal's attempt to order the cheapest item on the menu. "Order whatever you'd like. It's the least I can do." Once they had their drinks, Robert leaned forward, his expression serious. "Mr. Thompson, I won't betray." His expression serious. "Mr. Thompson, I won't pretend to understand your circumstances, but I recognize courage when I see it. You put yourself at risk to help a stranger, and that stranger happened to be my son." Jamal shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I just did what anyone would do," he mumbled. Robert shook his head. "No, not anyone. Most people would have looked the other way. You didn't, and for that, I'm deeply grateful." He paused, studying Jamal's face. "Tell me, Mr. Thompson, how did you end up on the streets?" The question caught Jamal off guard. He hesitated, then gave a brief, matter-of-fact account of the series of misfortunes that had led to his current situation. Robert listened intently, nodding occasionally. When Jamal finished, Robert sat back in his chair. "Life can be unpredictable," he said thoughtfully. "Sometimes, all it takes is one stroke of bad luck to change everything." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. "I'm in real estate development. We often need skilled workers for various projects. If you're interested, I might be able to help you get back on your feet." Jamal stared at the card, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. Hope, suspicion, and pride battled for dominance. "Why would you do this for me?" he asked finally. Robert's expression softened slightly. "Because you showed kindness to my son when you had nothing to gain from it. That says a lot about your character, Mr. Thompson. And in my experience, character is worth investing in." As their meeting drew to a close, Robert extended one more invitation. "My family would like to meet you properly. Would you join us for dinner this weekend?" Jamal hesitated, aware of the vast gulf between his world and the Prescotts. But something in Robert's steady gaze made him nod in agreement. As he left the cafe, Jamal felt a strange mix of excitement and apprehension. He was stepping into unknown territory, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change dramatically. Walking back to his usual spot in the alley, Jamal's mind raced with possibilities. The weight of years on the street seemed to lift slightly, replaced by a cautious optimism. However, a nagging voice in the back of his mind reminded him to be wary. He'd seen how quickly fortunes could change, for better or worse. As he settled in for the night, Jamal resolved to approach this unexpected opportunity with both hope and caution, unsure of where this new path might lead him. Jamal stood at the gates of the Prescott mansion, feeling more out of place than ever. He had managed to clean up as best he could at a public restroom, but his worn clothes still stood in stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the intercom button. "Mr. Thompson, please come in," a polite voice crackled through the speaker. The gates swung open silently. As Jamal walked up the long driveway, he couldn't help but marvel at the manicured lawns and the sheer size of the house. It was larger than any building he had ever worked on, even in his days as a carpenter. Tyler burst out of the front door before Jamal reached it. "Jamal, you came!" The boy's enthusiasm was genuine, but Jamal noticed a group of teenagers watching from a window, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disdain. Robert Prescott appeared behind his son, greeting Jamal with a firm handshake. "Welcome, Mr. Thompson. Please come inside." The interior of the house was even more impressive than the exterior. Jamal tried not to gawk at the crystal chandeliers, expensive artwork, and polished marble floors. He was led to a spacious living room where several people were gathered. "Everyone, this is Jamal Thompson," Robert announced. "Jamal, meet my wife Elizabeth and some of Tyler's friends." Elizabeth Prescott, an elegant woman in her late 40s, offered a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How nice of you to join us, Mr. Thompson." The teenagers mumbled greetings, their discomfort evident. Jamal recognized the looks they were giving him, a mixture of pity and suspicion he had grown accustomed to on the streets. Dinner was an elaborate affair, with multiple courses served by silent, efficient staff. Jamal struggled to remember which fork to use for each dish, acutely aware of the sidelong glances from the other guests. The conversation around the table was filled with references to exclusive schools, vacation homes, and business deals, a world entirely foreign to Jamal. He remained mostly silent, answering direct questions politely but briefly. "So, Jamal," one of Tyler's friends eventually asked, his tone slightly mocking, "what do you do for a living?" An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Tyler looked mortified, while his parents exchanged a worried glance. Jamal met the boy's gaze steadily. "Currently, I'm between jobs, but I used to work as a carpenter." "Oh, how interesting," the boy replied, clearly struggling to hide his disdain. Robert quickly steered the conversation to safer topics, but the tension remained palpable throughout the rest of the meal. After dinner, Tyler suggested they move to the game room. As the teenagers filed out, Jamal overheard one of them whisper, "Why did your dad invite some homeless guy to dinner?" "It's weird." In the game room, Jamal felt even more out of place. The space was filled with expensive entertainment systems, a pool table, and other luxuries he could hardly imagine. While the other boys eagerly started up a video game, Tyler hung back, looking uncomfortable. "I'm sorry about my friends," Tyler said quietly. "They can be, well, they don't understand." Jamal shrugged. "It's all right. I'm used to it." Tyler hesitated, then asked, "Can I ask you something? What's it like, living on the streets?" Jamal considered the question carefully. He could see genuine curiosity in Tyler's eyes, mixed with something else. Perhaps a hint of guilt or awareness of his own privilege. "It's hard," Jamal finally said. "Every day is a struggle. You never know where your next meal is coming from, or if you'll have a safe place to sleep. But you learn to be resourceful, to appreciate small kindnesses." Tyler nodded slowly. "I can't even imagine. I thought I had problems, but..." "Everyone has their own struggles," Jamal said gently. "Just because yours look different doesn't make them less real." Tyler looked surprised at this perspective. "I guess I never thought about it that way. It's just, there's so much pressure, to be perfect, to live up to my dad's expectations. Sometimes I feel like I can't breathe." Jamal listened as Tyler opened up about the pressures of his privileged life, the expectations to excel in school, to maintain a certain image, to follow in his father's footsteps. Despite the vast differences in their circumstances, Jamal recognized the universal human need for understanding and acceptance. As the evening drew to a close, Jamal found himself reflecting on the strange turn his life had taken. He had glimpsed a world of privilege and excess, but also one of hidden pressures and insecurities. Walking back to his usual sleeping spot, he felt a mix of emotions: gratitude for the opportunity he had been given, concern for Tyler, and a renewed appreciation for the simple freedoms of his life on the streets. The new world Jamal had experienced was complex and contradictory. It offered the promise of comfort and security, but also the threat of losing oneself in superficiality and expectations. As he settled in for the night, Jamal wondered how this experience would shape his path forward, and what role he might play in bridging the vast divide between his world and Tyler's. Weeks passed, and Jamal found himself increasingly drawn into the Prescott's world. Robert had made good on his promise, offering Jamal work on one of his construction projects. The steady income allowed Jamal to rent a small room and begin rebuilding his life. However, as he straddled two vastly different worlds, he found himself grappling with a series of internal challenges. One weekend, Jamal accompanied Tyler to the Prescott's country house for a lavish party. The sprawling estate was filled with the elite of New York society, all dressed in designer clothes and dripping with expensive jewelry. Jamal, in his newly purchased but modest attire, felt like a fish out of water. As he moved through the crowd, Jamal overheard snippets of conversation that made him increasingly uncomfortable. People discussed million-dollar deals, exclusive vacations, and frivolous purchases with casual ease. The stark contrast to his recent life on the streets was jarring. "Jamal, there you are." Tyler's voice cut through his thoughts. The boy was accompanied by a group of his school friends, all eyeing Jamal with barely concealed curiosity. "This is the guy I was telling you about," Tyler explained to his friends. "The one who saved me from those thugs." One of the boys, a tall, lanky teenager named Brandon, gave Jamal a once-over. "So you're the homeless hero, huh? Must be quite a change being here." Jamal tensed at the term homeless hero, but kept his voice level. "It's certainly different," he replied simply. "I bet," Brandon smirked. "Tell me, what's the weirdest thing you've had to eat while living on the streets? Ever had to fight off rats for food?" Tyler looked mortified. "Brandon, shut up," he hissed. But Brandon continued, his tone a mix of morbid curiosity and condescension. "No, really, I want to know. It must be like a whole different world out there. Do you guys have, like, a secret homeless code or something?" Jamal felt a surge of anger, but he pushed it down. He'd faced worse on the streets. "We're just people trying to survive," he said evenly. "Not much different from anyone else in that regard." Brandon looked disappointed by the mundane response. "Right. Well, enjoy the party. Try not to steal the silverware on your way out." As Brandon and his friends walked away laughing, Jamal saw the shame and apology in Tyler's eyes. "I'm so sorry about that," Tyler said. "Brandon's an idiot." Jamal shrugged, but inside, he was battling a mix of emotions. The encounter had brought his insecurities to the surface. Did he really belong here? Was he fooling himself by thinking he could be part of this world? Later that evening, Jamal found a quiet corner of the garden to collect his thoughts. He was surprised when Robert Prescott joined him. "Enjoying the party?" Robert asked, handing Jamal a glass of expensive scotch. Jamal took a sip, savoring the smooth burn. "It's different," he admitted. Robert nodded understandingly. "I couldn't help but overhear that conversation earlier. I hope you know that not everyone here shares Brandon's narrow-minded views." "I know," Jamal said, "but it does make me wonder if I'm kidding myself. This world, it's not mine." Robert was quiet for a moment. "You know, Jamal, I didn't grow up wealthy. My father was a factory worker, and we struggled to make ends meet. I worked hard to get where I am, but I never forgot where I came from." Jamal looked at Robert with newfound respect. "How do you do it? How do you fit into this world without losing yourself?" "It's not easy," Robert admitted. "There are days when I look around and wonder if I've lost sight of what really matters. But then, I remember why I worked so hard in the first place. To provide a better life for my family. To make a difference. The key is to stay true to your values, regardless of your circumstances." As they talked, Jamal felt some of his internal tension ease. He realized that his discomfort wasn't just about fitting into this new world, but about reconciling it with his past experiences and his sense of self. Returning to his small rented room after the party, Jamal thought about the people he'd known on the streets, their resilience, their sense of community, despite having nothing. He thought about Tyler, surrounded by wealth, but struggling with his own insecurities and pressures. Jamal realized that his unique perspective, straddling two worlds, could be a strength rather than a weakness. He didn't have to choose between his past and his potential future. Instead, he could use his experiences to bridge the gap, to bring understanding to both worlds. As he drifted off to sleep, Jamal made a decision. He would continue to work hard, to take advantage of the opportunities he'd been given. But he would also stay true to himself, to the lessons he'd learned on the streets. He would find a way to navigate this new world without losing sight of where he came from, and perhaps in doing so, he could help others see beyond the surface differences that divided people. The internal challenges were far from over, but Jamal felt more equipped to face them. He was forging his own path, one that didn't fit neatly into either world, but was uniquely his own. As summer turned to fall, Jamal's life had settled into a new routine. He was working steadily on Robert's construction projects, slowly rebuilding his savings and his confidence. His friendship with Tyler had grown, with the two often spending time together on weekends. However, as Tyler's senior year of high school began, Jamal noticed a change in the boy's demeanor. One crisp Saturday afternoon, they met at a small park near Jamal's apartment. Tyler looked stressed, his usual enthusiasm replaced by a worried frown. "What's eating you, kid?" Jamal asked as they sat on a bench. Tyler sighed heavily. "It's my dad. He's been on my case about college applications. He wants me to apply to his alma mater and study business, just like he did." Jamal nodded, encouraging Tyler to continue. "But I don't want to study business," Tyler admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to study environmental science. I want to make a difference, you know? But every time I try to talk to Dad about it, he shuts me down. Says it's not a practical career choice." Jamal could hear the pain and frustration in Tyler's voice. "Have you told him how you really feel?" Tyler shook his head. "I'm afraid to disappoint him. He's worked so hard to give me everything. How can I tell him I want to throw it all away?" "Choosing a different path isn't throwing anything away," Jamal said gently. "It's about being true to yourself." Tyler looked at Jamal, his eyes searching. "How did you do it? How did you find the courage to be yourself, even when the whole world seemed against you?" Jamal was quiet for a moment, thinking back to his darkest days on the streets. "It wasn't easy," he admitted. "There were times I wanted to give up, to be anyone else but myself. But in the end, I realized that being true to myself was the only way I could survive and find my way back." He turned to face Tyler directly. "Look, kid, I know your situation is different. You have opportunities I never had. But the principle is the same. You have to be honest about who you are and what you want. Otherwise, you'll spend your whole life trying to live up to someone else's expectations." Tyler nodded slowly, absorbing Jamal's words. "But what if I'm wrong? What if I'm making a huge mistake?" "Then it'll be your mistake to make," Jamal said firmly. "And you'll learn from it. That's part of growing up." As they continued talking, Jamal could see Tyler gathering his courage. By the end of their conversation, Tyler had decided to talk to his father about his true aspirations. A few days later, Jamal received a text from Tyler asking to meet urgently. They met at the same park, and Jamal immediately noticed Tyler's red-rimmed eyes and slumped shoulders. "I told him," Tyler said without preamble. "I told Dad I want to study environmental science." "How did he take it?" Jamal asked, though he could guess from Tyler's demeanor. "He freaked out," Tyler said, his voice cracking. "Said I was throwing away my future, that I was being ungrateful. He said I've been spending too much time with you, that you've been filling my head with unrealistic ideas." Jamal felt a pang of guilt and worry. He had encouraged Tyler to be honest, but he hadn't anticipated this backlash. "I'm sorry, Tyler. I never meant to cause problems between you and your dad." Tyler shook his head vehemently. "No, don't apologize. You're the only one who's ever encouraged me to think for myself. Dad, he just wants me to be a carbon copy of him." As they talked, Jamal could see the toll this conflict was taking on Tyler. The boy was torn between his desire to please his father and his own aspirations. Jamal realized that their friendship, which had been a source of strength for both of them, was now in danger of becoming a point of contention. Maybe I should back off for a while," Jamal suggested reluctantly. "Give you and your dad some space to work things out." "No." Tyler's response was immediate and forceful. "You're my friend, Jamal. One of the few real friends I have. I'm not going to let my dad's prejudices ruin that." Jamal felt a mix of pride and concern at Tyler's loyalty. He knew that standing up to his father was a big step for Tyler, but he also worried about the potential consequences. "All right," Jamal said finally, "but we need to be smart about this. Your relationship with your father is important, Tyler. We can't just ignore his concerns." They spent the next hour strategizing, trying to find a way to bridge the gap between Tyler's aspirations and his father's expectations. Jamal suggested that Tyler research successful entrepreneurs in the environmental sector to show his father that his passion could also lead to a viable career. As they parted ways, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that their friendship was entering a crucial phase. He had grown to care deeply for Tyler, seeing in him a chance to make a real difference in someone's life. But he also knew that the road ahead would be challenging, filled with difficult conversations and potential setbacks. Walking back to his apartment, Jamal resolved to be there for Tyler, while also respecting the Prescott family's dynamics. He hoped that somehow they could find a way through this crisis without sacrificing the friendship that had come to mean so much to both of them. A few weeks after Tyler's confrontation with his father, Jamal received an unexpected call from Robert Prescott. The businessman's voice sounded strained as he asked Jamal to meet him at his office. Unsure of what to expect, Jamal made his way to the imposing skyscraper that housed Prescott Developments. Robert's office was a stark contrast to the opulent mansion Jamal had visited. It was functional and businesslike, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Robert himself looked tired, the usual confidence in his bearing somewhat diminished. "Thank you for coming, Jamal," Robert said, gesturing for him to take a seat. "I owe you an apology. I reacted poorly to Tyler's revelation. I said some things about you that were unfair and untrue." Jamal nodded, accepting the apology but remaining cautious. "I understand you're concerned about Tyler's future. That's natural for a parent." Robert sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. "It's more complicated than that. There's something you need to know. Something that might help you understand why this situation has me so rattled." He stood up and walked to the window, his back to Jamal. "I had a brother, Tommy. He was 2 years younger than me. Growing up, we didn't have much, but we had each other. Tommy was always the dreamer in the family, full of big ideas about changing the world." Robert's voice grew softer, tinged with old pain. "When we were in our 20s, Tommy decided he wanted to join an environmental group. They were planning a protest against a big logging company in Oregon. I thought it was a waste of time, told him he should focus on getting a real job instead." He turned back to face Jamal, his eyes clouded with memory. "We had a huge fight about it. I said some terrible things, told him he was being selfish and irresponsible. Tommy left for Oregon the next day. We never spoke again." Jamal leaned forward, sensing the weight of what was coming next. "There was an accident at the protest site," Robert continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "A tree fell the wrong way. Tommy, he didn't make it." The office fell silent as Jamal absorbed this revelation. Suddenly, Robert's reaction to Tyler's ambitions took on a new dimension. "I'm sorry," Jamal said softly. "I had no idea." Robert nodded, composing himself. "After Tommy died, I threw myself into my work. I was determined to be successful, to prove that my way was the right way. And I did succeed, beyond my wildest dreams. But there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about Tommy, about the things I said to him." He sat back down, looking directly at Jamal. "When Tyler told me he wanted to study environmental science, all I could think about was Tommy. I saw my son putting himself in danger, throwing away his future. I reacted out of fear, not reason." Jamal considered his words carefully before responding. "Mr. Prescott, I can't imagine how painful that must have been for you. But Tyler isn't Tommy. The world has changed a lot since then. Environmental science isn't just about protests anymore. It's a respected field with real career prospects." Robert nodded slowly. "I know that, logically. But emotionally, it's hard to separate the past from the present." "Have you ever told Tyler about his uncle?" Jamal asked. Robert shook his head. "I've never told anyone the full story. After it happened, it was just too painful to talk about. And later, well, it never seemed like the right time." And Jamal leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Prescott, I think Tyler needs to hear this story. Not to change his mind, but to understand where you're coming from. And maybe it's time for you to honor Tommy's memory by supporting Tyler's dreams instead of fearing them." Robert was quiet for a long moment, considering Jamal's words. Finally, he nodded. "You're right. It's time I face this. Thank you, Jamal. You've given me a lot to think about." As Jamal left the office, he felt a mix of emotions. He was moved by Robert's vulnerability and impressed by the man's willingness to confront his past. But he also felt the weight of responsibility. He had become more than just Tyler's friend. He was now a bridge between father and son, tasked with helping them understand each other. Walking through the bustling streets of New York, Jamal reflected on how his own past had shaped him. His experiences on the streets, the hardships he'd faced, had given him a unique perspective that was now proving valuable in ways he never could have imagined. He realized that the revelations from the past weren't just about the Prescotts. They were about him too. His journey from homelessness to this point had equipped him with empathy, resilience, and wisdom that were now helping others navigate their own challenges. As he headed home, Jamal felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the road ahead would still be challenging, but he was ready to play his part in helping the Prescotts heal old wounds and build a new understanding. The weeks following Robert's revelation were tense. Jamal found himself in the difficult position of mediator between Tyler and his father, each struggling to understand the other's perspective. While Robert had agreed to share the story of his brother with Tyler, the conversation had opened old wounds and created new tensions within the family. One crisp autumn evening, Jamal received a frantic call from Tyler. "Can you meet me at Central Park, near the Bethesda fountain?" Tyler's voice was strained, barely containing his emotions. Worried, Jamal rushed to the park. He found Tyler sitting on a bench, his shoulders slumped, staring blankly at the fountain. As Jamal approached, he could see the redness around Tyler's eyes, evidence of recent tears. "Hey, kid, what's going on?" Jamal asked gently, sitting down next to Tyler. Tyler took a shaky breath before speaking. "It's all falling apart, Jamal. Ever since Dad told me about Uncle Tommy, things have been so weird at home. Mom's upset that Dad kept it a secret all these years. Dad's alternating between being overprotective and completely withdrawn. And me? I feel like I'm walking on eggshells all the time." Jamal listened patiently as Tyler poured out his frustrations. The revelation about his uncle had shaken Tyler's understanding of his family and his father's motivations. While he appreciated finally knowing the truth, it had also complicated his decision about his future. "I don't know what to do anymore," Tyler continued, his voice cracking. "Part of me wants to just give in, go study business like Dad wants. Maybe then things would go back to normal. But another part of you knows that wouldn't be true to yourself," Jamal finished for him. Tyler nodded miserably. "Yeah, and now, on top of everything else, there's this whole thing with Brandon and the guys at school." Jamal frowned. "What thing with Brandon?" Tyler sighed heavily. "He found out about you, about your background, I mean. He's been running his mouth, saying all sorts of nasty things, calling you a charity case, and saying my dad must be crazy to let a homeless guy hang around his family." Jamal felt a familiar twinge of anger and hurt, but he pushed it aside. Tyler needed him to be calm and rational right now. "And how do you feel about what Brandon's saying?" Jamal asked carefully. Tyler's head snapped up, his eyes wide with indignation. "It's bull. You're my friend, Jamal. You've been more real with me than any of those guys ever have. I told Brandon to shove it, but it's causing problems. Some of the other guys are taking his side. They're saying I've changed, that I'm turning my back on them." Jamal nodded slowly, understanding the social pressure Tyler was under. "That's tough, kid. But you know, sometimes standing up for what's right means standing alone for a while." Tyler was quiet for a moment, then spoke softly. "Jamal, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Always," Jamal replied. "Am I making a mistake? Pushing for environmental science, standing up to my dad, defending our friendship? Is it worth all this conflict?" Jamal considered his words carefully. "Tyler, I can't answer that for you. Only you know what's in your heart, what you're willing to fight for. But I can tell you this. In my experience, the things that are truly worth having in life often require us to face some conflict and discomfort. He paused, making sure Tyler was really listening. The easy path isn't always the right one. Sometimes we have to be willing to weather the storm to get to where we need to be. Tyler nodded slowly, absorbing Jamal's words. I feel so alone in all this. Jamal put a hand on Tyler's shoulder. You're not alone, kid. I'm here. And I think your parents are trying, in their own way. They're just struggling with their own fears and past traumas. As they sat there, watching the fountain and the passers-by, Jamal felt the weight of the situation. He knew that his presence in Tyler's life, while beneficial in many ways, was also a source of tension. He wondered, not for the first time, if he was doing more harm than good. Tyler, he said finally, if you think it would help, if you need some space to figure things out with your family and friends, I can step back for a while. Tyler's response was immediate and forceful. No way. You're one of the few people who gets me, Jamal. I'm not giving that up just because some rich jerks can't see past their own prejudices. Jamal felt a mix of pride and concern at Tyler's loyalty. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but he was committed to supporting Tyler through it. As they parted ways that evening, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that they were approaching a critical juncture. The conflicts within Tyler's family, among his peers, and in Tyler's own heart were coming to a head. Whatever happened next would shape not just Tyler's future, but the dynamics of their friendship and the Prescott family as a whole. Walking home, Jamal steeled himself for the challenges ahead. He had faced homelessness, hunger, and despair. He could face this too, for Tyler's sake and for his own. The conflict might be uncomfortable, but Jamal knew that sometimes it was through conflict that real growth and change occurred. As the conflict within the Prescott family intensified, Jamal found himself increasingly torn between his loyalty to Tyler and his growing concern about the impact of their friendship on Tyler's life. One chilly morning, feeling overwhelmed by the situation, Jamal decided to take a walk through his old neighborhood, the streets where he had spent his homeless years. The familiar sights and sounds of the area brought a flood of memories. As he turned a corner, he spotted a young man huddled in a doorway, his possessions packed into a worn backpack beside him. The scene was all too familiar to Jamal. Without hesitation, Jamal approached the young man. "Hey there," he said gently. "You okay?" The man looked up, wariness evident in his eyes. "I'm fine," he mumbled. Jamal nodded, understanding the defensiveness. "I get it. I've been where you are. Name's Jamal. Mind if I sit for a bit?" After a moment's hesitation, the young man shrugged. "Free country. I'm Mike." Jamal settled himself on the ground next to Mike, careful to give him space. "How long have you been out here, Mike?" "Couple of months," Mike replied, his voice barely audible. "Lost my job, then my apartment. Been trying to get back on my feet, but..." Jamal listened as Mike shared his story, one that echoed Jamal's own experiences. As they talked, Jamal found himself sharing tips for surviving on the streets, safe places to sleep, where to find free meals, how to stay warm in the winter. "You seem to know a lot about this," Mike observed. Jamal nodded. "I lived on these streets for 2 years. It's tough, but you can get through it. The key is to not lose hope, to keep pushing forward even when it seems impossible." As they continued to talk, Jamal felt a familiar sense of camaraderie, the unspoken understanding that exists between those who have experienced homelessness. It was a stark contrast to the world he had been navigating with the Prescotts. Before leaving, Jamal gave Mike information about local shelters and job training programs. "And here," he said, pressing some cash into Mike's hand. "It's not much, but it might help. Mike's eyes widened. "I can't take this," he protested. "You can," Jamal insisted. "And when you're back on your feet, pay it forward to someone else who needs it." As Jamal walked away, he felt a mix of emotions. The encounter with Mike had grounded him, reminding him of where he came from and how far he had come. But it also highlighted the vast gulf between his past life and his current situation with the Prescotts. Over the next few days, Jamal found himself drawn back to his old neighborhood. He started spending more time at the local shelter, helping out where he could and offering guidance to those trying to get off the streets. The work was familiar, challenging, and deeply rewarding. One evening, as Jamal was leaving the shelter, he was surprised to see Tyler waiting for him outside. "How did you find me?" Jamal asked, caught off guard. Tyler shrugged. "I called around when you weren't answering your phone. Someone at the construction site mentioned you'd been coming here. What's going on, Jamal? Why have you been avoiding me?" Jamal sighed, realizing he owed Tyler an explanation. They walked to a nearby park, finding a quiet bench to talk. "I needed some time to think," Jamal began. "Being around your family, seeing all the conflict my presence was causing, I started to wonder if I was doing more harm than good." Tyler listened intently as Jamal explained his return to his old neighborhood, his work at the shelter, and the perspective it had given him. "I realize now that I've been trying to fit into your world, Tyler," Jamal said. "But in doing that, I was losing touch with who I am, where I came from. These people, this community, they're part of me. I can't just leave that behind." Tyler was quiet for a moment, processing Jamal's words. "I get it," he said finally. "But Jamal, you don't have to choose. You can be part of both worlds. That's what makes you unique. What makes your perspective so valuable." Jamal looked at Tyler, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "Maybe you're right, but it's not just about me, Tyler. Your family—" "My family needs to adapt," Tyler interrupted firmly. "Dad's struggling, sure, but he's trying. And Mom, she told me the other day how glad she is that I have a friend like you, someone who's lived in the real world and can keep me grounded." As they continued to talk, Jamal felt some of the tension he'd been carrying start to ease. He realized that in trying to protect Tyler and the Prescotts, he had been denying an essential part of himself. "So what now?" Tyler asked as their conversation wound down. Jamal thought for a moment. "Now, we find a balance. I'll keep working with the Prescott development projects, but I'm also going to stay involved here, at the shelter. And Tyler, I think it's time you saw this side of the world too. Not just as an observer, but as someone who can make a real difference." Tyler nodded eagerly. "I'd like that. Maybe we could even get Dad involved somehow. Show him that environmental concerns and business success aren't mutually exclusive." As they parted ways that evening, Jamal felt a renewed sense of purpose. His return to his roots hadn't been a step backward, as he'd initially feared. Instead, it had been a necessary journey to reconcile his past with his present, allowing him to move forward with authenticity and clarity. The path ahead was still uncertain, but Jamal felt better equipped to navigate it. By embracing all aspects of his identity, the street-smart survivor and the aspiring professional, he could serve as a unique bridge between two worlds, potentially bringing about positive change for both the Prescotts and his old community. The tension that had been building within the Prescott family and Jamal's conflicted feelings finally came to a head one rainy afternoon. Robert Prescott had called Jamal to his office, his voice terse and businesslike over the phone. As Jamal rode the elevator up to the top floor of Prescott Developments, he steeled himself for what he sensed would be a difficult conversation. Robert was standing by the window when Jamal entered, his posture rigid and his face etched with worry lines. He turned as Jamal approached, gesturing for him to take a seat. "Jamal," Robert began, his voice carefully controlled, "I've asked you here today because we need to discuss some concerns that have arisen. Jamal nodded, keeping his expression neutral. What kind of concerns, Mr. Prescott? Robert paced behind his desk, clearly struggling with his words. I've recently become aware of some financial difficulties the company is facing. We're not in danger, but we're not as stable as I'd like us to be. In light of this, I've been reconsidering some of our projects, including the low-income housing development you've been working on. Jamal felt a knot forming in his stomach. The low-income housing project had been his pride and joy, a chance to give back to the community he'd come from. Are you thinking of canceling the project? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Robert sighed heavily. Not canceling, necessarily, but perhaps scaling back, redirecting some of the funds to more profitable ventures. Jamal leaned forward, his mind racing. Mr. Prescott, that project is vital to the community. It's not just about housing. It's about giving people a chance at stability, at a better life. I understand that, Jamal, Robert replied, a hint of frustration creeping into his voice. But I have to think about the overall health of the company. If we're not profitable, we can't help anyone. Jamal took a deep breath, choosing his next words carefully. With all due respect, Mr. Prescott, I think you're making a mistake. That project has the potential to transform lives. It could be a model for socially responsible development. Robert's expression hardened. And what do you know about running a business, Jamal? About balancing the books and keeping shareholders happy? The words stung, but Jamal refused to back down. I may not know much about running a big corporation, sir, but I know about survival. I know about the difference a stable home can make in a person's life. And I thought you knew that too. A tense silence fell over the room. Robert turned back to the window, his shoulders tense. When he spoke again, his voice was low and strained. There's something else we need to discuss, Jamal. Your relationship with Tyler. Jamal felt a surge of defensiveness. What about it? Robert turned to face him. I'm concerned about the influence you're having on him. This environmental science fixation, his sudden interest in social issues, it's distracting him from his future. With all due respect, Mr. Prescott, Jamal said, struggling to keep his voice level. Tyler is his own person. He's passionate about making a difference in the world. Isn't that something to be proud of? Of course it is, Robert snapped. But there are practical considerations. The world isn't as simple as Tyler, or you, seem to think it is. Jamal stood up, unable to contain his frustration any longer. Mr. Prescott, I understand you're worried about Tyler and about your company, but pushing Tyler into a life he doesn't want, canceling projects that could really help people, that's not the answer. You told me about your brother, about the regrets you carry. Are you sure you're not making the same mistakes again? Robert's face paled at the mention of his brother. For a moment, Jamal thought he'd gone too far. But then something in Robert's expression shifted. You're right, Robert said quietly, surprising Jamal. I am afraid of failing, of letting people down, of losing Tyler the way I lost Tommy. But I'm realizing that my fear might be pushing away the very people I'm trying to protect. Jamal felt the tension in the room begin to dissipate. It's not too late to change course, Mr. Prescott. The housing project, Tyler's dreams, they're not threats to your success. They're opportunities to leave a real, lasting legacy. Robert sank into his chair, suddenly looking tired. I don't know how to bridge this gap, Jamal, between what I've always believed about success and what Tyler and you are showing me. Jamal sat back down, his voice softening. Maybe that's where I can help. I've lived in both worlds. I've seen how they can connect, how they can make each other better. If you're willing to take a risk, to trust in a different kind of success, I think we could create something truly remarkable. As they continued to talk, The confrontation gradually transformed into a conversation. Ideas were exchanged, compromises suggested, and a new understanding began to form. By the time Jamal left the office hours later, he felt a mix of exhaustion and hope. The confrontation had been difficult, but necessary. It had brought long simmering issues to the surface and forced both Jamal and Robert to confront their fears and prejudices. While not everything was resolved, Jamal sensed that they had taken an important step forward. As he rode the elevator down, Jamal reflected on how far he'd come from his days on the street. He had found his voice, stood up for his beliefs, and potentially changed the course of not just his own life, but many others as well. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Jamal felt truly optimistic about the future. The days following the confrontation with Robert Prescott were a whirlwind of activity and emotion for Jamal. He had expected some fallout from their heated discussion, but what actually transpired caught him completely off guard. It was a crisp Monday morning when Jamal received an unexpected call from Robert's assistant asking him to come to the office immediately. With a mix of apprehension and curiosity, Jamal made his way to Prescott Developments. As he entered Robert's office, he was surprised to find not just Robert, but also Tyler and Elizabeth Prescott, along with a man he didn't recognize. The stranger, a sharp-eyed individual in his 40s, stood as Jamal entered. "Ah, Mr. Thompson," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm James Carson from the New York Times. I was just discussing a rather interesting story with the Prescotts, and your name came up." Jamal shook Carson's hand, confusion evident on his face. He looked to Robert for explanation. Robert cleared his throat, looking both nervous and determined. "Jamal, after our talk the other day, I did a lot of thinking. I realized that it was time for a change, not just in how I run my business, but in how I approach life in general." He gestured for Jamal to sit. "I've decided to go public with our low-income housing project. Not just continue it, but expand it. And I want to tell the whole story, including your role in it." Jamal's eyes widened in surprise. "Mr. Prescott, I don't understand. What's going on?" Carson jumped in, his eyes gleaming with journalistic interest. "Mr. Prescott has approached us with quite a story, Mr. Thompson. A homeless man who saves a wealthy teenager from muggers, becomes friends with the family, and ends up inspiring a multi-million-dollar project to combat homelessness. It's the kind of human interest story that could make a real impact." Jamal felt overwhelmed. He looked at Tyler, who was beaming with pride, and then at Elizabeth, who offered a warm, encouraging smile. "But that's not all," Robert continued. "I've been in talks with some colleagues in the business world. We're putting together a coalition to address urban poverty and sustainable development. And I want you, Jamal, to be a key part of it." Jamal sat in stunned silence for a moment, trying to process everything. I don't know what to say. This is all so sudden." Tyler leaned forward, his eyes shining with excitement. "Dad and I have been talking a lot, Jamal, about the future, about what really matters. We want to use our resources to make a real difference, and we want you to help us do it." Elizabeth nodded in agreement. "Your perspective, your experience, it's invaluable, Jamal. You've already changed our family for the better. Imagine what you could do on a larger scale." As the conversation continued, Jamal's mind raced with possibilities. The project he'd been working on could be just the beginning. With the Prescott's resources and his own first-hand knowledge of life on the streets, they could create programs that truly address the root causes of homelessness. But amidst the excitement, a nagging doubt crept in. Jamal turned to Carson, the journalist. "Mr. Carson, if you publish this story, won't it seem like the Prescotts are just doing this for publicity?" Carson smiled, appreciating Jamal's candor. "That's always a risk with stories like these. But from what I've seen and heard today, I think there's a genuine desire for change here. And sometimes, Mr. Thompson, a little publicity can be a good thing if it inspires others to take action. Robert nodded in agreement. Jamal, I know this is all happening fast, and I know you might have reservations, but I meant what I said the other day. I want to leave a real, lasting legacy, not just for Tyler, but for the community. Will you help us do that? Jamal looked around the room, at the eager faces of the Prescotts and the curious gaze of the journalist. He thought about Mike, the young man he'd met on the streets, and countless others like him. He thought about the journey that had brought him from homelessness to this moment of opportunity. Taking a deep breath, Jamal made his decision. "All right," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Let's do this, but let's do it right. No sugarcoating, no glossing over the hard truths. If we're going to tell this story, let's tell all of it, the good, the bad, and everything in between." The room erupted in smiles and nods of agreement. As they began to discuss the details of the story and the plans for the future, Jamal felt a surge of hope and purpose. He realized that this wasn't just a turnaround for the Prescotts or for himself. It was a chance to create a real turnaround for countless others who were struggling. As the meeting wound down, Jamal found himself standing by the window, looking out over the city. Tyler joined him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You okay?" Tyler asked. "I know this is a lot to take in." Jamal nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Yeah, I'm okay. Just thinking about how life can change in an instant. One moment you're fighting to survive, the next you're planning to change the world." Tyler grinned. "Well, if anyone can do it, it's you, Jamal. You've already changed our world. Now it's time to take on the rest of it." As they stood there, looking out over the city they both called home, Jamal felt a sense of possibility he hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead would be challenging, no doubt. But for the first time, he felt truly equipped to face those challenges. With the Prescott's resources, his own hard-earned wisdom, and a shared commitment to making a difference, Jamal knew that they had the potential to create real, lasting change. The story that had begun with a chance encounter in a dark alley was about to take on a new chapter, one that could potentially transform not just their lives, but the lives of countless others. As Jamal contemplated this unexpected turnaround, he felt ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that sometimes the most profound changes come from the most unlikely beginnings.